Key lessons deleted in NCERT school textbooks. The Indian Express matched NCERT's revisions with content in 21 history, political science, and sociology textbooks for classes 6 to 12 and found some sweeping changes.
We were aware and that the NCERT is in the process of rationalizing textbooks. I use the word rationalizing because that's the term that NCERT has been using officially. This started about 6 months ago, last year in December, when NCERT, in an official communication to its department, had said that during COVID, kids, haven't had enough time to kind of cover the syllabus and curriculum. So maybe we should try and reduce the curriculum load. And that was the ground that was presented to justify this entire exercise, that this is being done to help kids out across classes 6 to 12. That is an overwhelming amount of information. So for the project, what we decided to do is that we chose social science because BJP's history with revising social science textbooks has been a bit controversial at the time when it was in power, when Vajpayee was the prime minister. So we decided to just look at social science, which is essentially political science history. We didn't look at geography, we looked at political science, we looked at history and sociology in classes 11, 12. And just sort of very dispassionately look at the changes that have been made in the textbooks, from the point of view of quote unquote reducing curriculum load. So these were essentially 21 textbooks of history, political science, sociology from classes 6 to 12. It was a lot in itself. And what we did was, you have to remember that these textbooks haven't been reprinted. So what NCERT has done instead has printed booklets, little booklets for each class along, and each booklet carries a table of changes, sort of for reference, will provide you the textbook name, the chapter, page number, and what has been dropped or changed. Because, it mentions a certain page and says box 7.8 dropped, or mentions a certain page and say line 7 to 8 dropped of the second paragraph. So you have to constantly keep going back to the textbook to match it. And again, then that's not where the exercise ends. In order to, kind of do this thoroughly and exhaustively, what I had to do was that I had to read the entire textbook and not just refer to the bits that have been dropped, just to kind of, get a sense of, why this thing that has been dropped was mentioned in the first place. What was the context? Most of the changes were kind of fitting three baskets. One was that there were many changes as far as contemporary India is concerned, India post-independence. There was a lot of content from that time period which was being changed. So for instance, the first part is on contemporary India. So the reference to at least two references to Gujarat riots have been dropped. Then there were overwhelmingly, actually, what really stood out for me is that how much content with regard to resistance, protests, and social movements was removed. It to a point that almost everything to do with protests and social movements has been completely removed from political science textbooks classes 6 to 12. There were at least 3 chapters that have been dropped from the textbooks from classes 6 to 12. The only chapter on social movements that has been retained is in actually class 12 sociology. So only if you opted for sociology in class 12 would you actually get to study it. And even that chapter, there are a lot of changes that have been made. So that really stood out for me. And by the way, these chapters, just to give you an example, the social movement chapters actually deal with protests in contemporary India, protests that have happened after independence. For instance, Narmada Bachao Andolan, the Chipko movement, all references to, if you can call the Naxalite movement a movement, but all references to Naxalism, Naxalite movement completely removed. Very interestingly, this was a very small part of the story, but just to give you another example of what has been removed with regard to contemporary India, is that this was the only mention, and I checked this thoroughly, across all history textbooks and political science textbooks from classes 6 to 12, they only mention a sedition, why it's controversial, or rather, why is it an arbitrary law? That mention has been dropped completely, along with a small exercise, just two small questions, which ask students to state why this is an arbitrary law and why they think this was arbitrary. Just to give you another example, our part two, by the way, since we are talking about themes, so I'll just quickly tell you the second theme was cuts related to caste discrimination and minorities, that content. And the third theme, of course, was a very obvious one. There was no surprises there. There's a lot of content that was cut with regard to rulers of the Delhi Sultanate era and the Mughals. And this is something that members of the BJP have said it time and again. In fact, more so now, like in the last 1 year, they've made several mentions of how they feel that the Indian history, especially one that's taught in schools, is not an accurate representation of what happened in the past. In fact, certain rulers or certain invaders, quote unquote, are glorified at the expense of others. What was very interesting is that while I was working on this project, I noticed that one table pertaining to the class 7 history textbook had been mysteriously dropped and replaced with something new. We had downloaded all the tables, we kept it with us, which is why we were able to tell the difference, because there were at least 5 changes which were there in the old table in the class 7 history textbook, which were not there in the new table. And by the way, the class 7 history textbook is the only textbook which has 2 whole dedicated chapters, one to Delhi Sultanate and one to the Mughal Empire, and two more, apart from these 2 chapters, 2 additional chapters in which a majority of the content is focused on the Mughal era. And what happened immediately after the downfall of the Mughal era. So there are essentially these, and so I think almost 90% of the cuts pertaining to the Delhi Sultanate, basically Muslim rulers of the country, are in one textbook, and hence majority of the cuts pertaining to these 2 eras are in the history textbook. And it was for this textbook that there was initially a table and then a new one. So we have made it a point to point out what is it that was there in the old table, which no longer reflects on the NCERT website. And what was interesting is that one of the changes is about Mahmud Ghazni of Afghanistan. He, by the way, is popularly known as the invader who raided the Somnath temple. So with regard to him, by the way, he hasn't been mentioned in detail. It's in just one chapter. I think at best there are maybe 3 paragraphs, actually not even 3 paragraphs on him. So as far as he's concerned, they have dropped the word Sultan from that title from his name. And very interesting, there's one sentence which says that he raided the subcontinent several times, So they've tweaked that sentence to state that he raided the subcontinent 17 times, fair enough. But what they've added is with a religious motive, that his invasions were motivated. I mean, they had a religious motive behind it. And just immediately after this, there is a paragraph which talks about how Ghazni, the invader, also took a lot of interest in the people that he conquered. And how did he take interest? By, sort of commissioning a scholar to document their lives. So they've dropped that paragraph itself, where he seems to have shown interest in people he conquered. For instance, the Delhi Sultanate chapter, they have dropped the bit on expansion of Delhi Sultanate towards south of India. And in the Mughal Empire chapter, they have dropped a lot of tables with on the achievements and milestones of different Mughal emperors. But yeah, so most of the changes with regard to the Muslim rulers are in one textbook, purely because most of the content on them is in that one textbook. Another textbook where they are mentioned in detail, there was one chapter called in class 12 history textbook. It's called, I forget what it's exactly called, but it's essentially on chronicles that were written during the Mughal era, basically, because a lot of these Mughal emperors employed scholars to, kind of chronicle court scenes and chronicle their life through paintings and stuff. So that whole chapter was about how these chronicles have been helpful for historians to understand life during that era. So that whole chapter in class 12 has also been dropped. So yeah, so in short, content pertaining to them have suffered pretty deep cuts in the textbook revision. Yeah. But yeah, coming back to how we tried being fair is that I remember in one of the changes made, I forget which textbook, but the definition of what Dalit means, that it basically means broken. and why untouchables sort of identify themselves as Dalit. That was there, and if I wanted, we could have had that also as one of the changes. But I realized that that same definition was also mentioned in a few other chapters. So to be fair, if that exact definition was mentioned elsewhere and dropped here, we didn't put that in the second part. But there were certain, like especially a lot of examples with regard to how untouchability operates in real life. What does the ordeal of a manual scavenger look like, or how the caste system ensures that Dalits are confined to certain occupations. Those specific sentences being dropped, that seemed like a pattern. We thought it was worth flagging. So while going through these books, what I realized is that some of the changes seemed very selective. A couple of sentences a couple of words being removed from certain sentences. Now that exactly, I don't know. I mean, that seems too selective and doesn't really fit the idea of reducing curriculum load. How does tweaking a sentence change anything? I get it at some level, maybe dropping a chapter or dropping a chunk of it can still be justified, but making very specific changes with reference to, say, Dalit, discrimination, or untouchability, that kind of, there was a certain pattern that was emerging. So, I mean, we started with just matching the tables with the textbooks. Once we had made a list of the changes, then going back and reading all the chapters to understand where these changes fit and what impact they have. Once we had read those chapters and we reread them, reread everything to understand if there are any patterns that were emerging, but just those changes by themselves in isolation, kind of may not fit together. So we did that. And I think it was by the third reading, we were able to identify patterns. We spoke with the NCERT director, Mr. Dinesh Saklani. He joined pretty recently. He joined in February. By the way, this is when the entire rationalization exercise was kind of pretty much over. I think almost 99% of it would have been done. So he kind of joined at the fag end of it. So a lot of these changes had been finalized by them. His initial response to us was that, it would be unfair for me to comment on it because, everything was done and dusted by the time I came in. So I wouldn't want to comment on. This is around the time when, right before the first part came in. At that point, he said that, he's kind of tried to take more interest in what happened back then. And he has realized that this was a very professional exercise conducted by NCERT, that there were external experts invited for the entire exercise, and that NCERT maintained an arm's length. I mean, it didn't interfere with what experts felt with regard to what content should be dropped and what should be retained. And essentially that this is an exercise which is not limited to social science. This is an exercise which is done across subjects, and that we are possibly being selective in highlighting only what happened in social science. And finally, that NCERT couldn't be unfair to the kids, which seem to have gone through a lot in the last 2 years. Especially, there wasn't enough time academically and emotionally, and that there wasn't enough time to even cover the syllabus. So and just for, say, social science, by the way, is one subject in class from classes 6 to 12. It's only in history that you study history, political science. All of them are separate subjects. For one paper, of which maybe history just makes up 20 or 30 marks, how much should kids study? So we had to be fair to them. That was their response. When we asked them specifically about the discrepancies between the two tables that I mentioned, he wasn't aware of any old table or a new table. He said that maybe it was sort of a working draft or something that went up by mistake, and that we should stick to whatever it is that is finally up on the NCERT website. This exercise completed, they were way behind schedule. For textbooks to have been reprinted, they should have finished a rationalization exercise at least 6 months back. They finished that pretty late. So now what they have done is that instead of reprinting textbooks, which takes time, they have printed these little booklets, which, by the way, these changes are effective immediately, and students, the stakeholders, will have to refer to these booklets, which are being distributed freely.